Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. We are now done with our discussion on peace v. freedom, but we are still going through some of the more explorative, fun parts, at least we find them fun parts of this series. We are still moving on um, with some speeches that we laid out, quite a few of them, by separate world leaders, most of them American, of liberal democratic states at certain key moments in American history, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt. Actually, no, I think Roosevelt was still vice president at this time in 1901 when he made his big stick speech talking about the future of American diplomacy in a world after America had proven itself on the global stage. In 1901, um, or more accurately, in 1897, America was still seen as a regional power in the American continents. That it was the strongest among all the nations nearby it, but it could not contend with the European power. That was proven wrong, though, in 1898 with the war against Spain and the quick victory that we achieved against them in Cuba, as well as at the Battle of Manila Bay. 3 years later, in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt, who actually was a veteran of that war, spoke, talking about the future of uh, American diplomacy. And he started with saying, quote, "Let us make it evident that we intend to do justice. Then let us make it equally evident that we will not tolerate injustice being done to us in return. Let us further make it evident that we use no words which we are not prepared to back up with deeds, and that while our speech is always moderate, we are ready and willing to make it good. Such an attitude will be the surest possible guarantee of that self-respecting peace, the attainment of which is and must ever be the prime aim of a self-governing people." So with that, we see that um, that the aim of America, if it has not already been expressed, should be expressed in future with the truth that America ideally cares about justice, not just for its own people, but people in general. That was the point that I was making that last episode that Chad concluded that um, that American ideals of human dignity and liberalism are not just American ideas, they're human ideas. So justice doesn't need to mean justice between like the American people within our country. Although in 1901, that was a big issue that needed to be resolved. It's also justice in other countries. The reason America went to war against Spain was because of a decade of human rights abuses in Cuba that Spain was enacting against the native people over there and the people that have been recently um, um, I'm calling for independence against Spain. That their independence, and then their movement for independence was being struck by a military commando sent by the Spanish government in Madrid, known as the Butcher, to the people in Cuba, and committing again human rights abuses against those people, rounding them up into camps, and essentially conducting what would be called today um, crimes against humanity. And America, had its own questionable reasons for joining the war. Many believe that we tried to join the war unethically, by sending over a ship that need not be there, the USS Maine, to the port of Havana to instigate a war in which we would gain the territory of Spain's colonies in the Atlantic and the Pacific. But it was really because of the human rights abuses that Spain was was pushing upon the Filipino population as well as the Cuban population. And that's really what Teddy Roosevelt meant when he said that we intend to do justice. And when he said we will not tolerate injustice being done to us in return, he wasn't just talking about America. He will, in future speeches that we're going to mention, like the one with the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904, that he's also talking about injustice in other countries because America is no longer a regional power in 1901, maybe in 1897, but in 1901 and 1904, America is a global power.
Yeah. And then we could have that be backed up by what he would say later, that let us make further evident that we use no words which we are not prepared to back up with deeds. So we espouse these values of human rights, of freedom, of peace that we would like to see in the world, but now we are making them happen. We are taking actions in which we can spread these ideals, where we could secure our interests, where we can ensure that our system of liberalism is evident around the world. And this was a core tendency of Teddy Roosevelt. He was a very, of course, a very pro American man, but a very pro liberalism man, in which liberalism needed to be spread not just in the region around America, but around the world. It would take time for that to really come into fruition um, later on by the time Teddy Roosevelt has passed. But these were the ideas that he would kind of espouse, and we will get in this speech. And so to continue along with this speech, another excerpt from that is, quote, "This is the attitude we should take as regards to the Monroe Doctrine. There is not the least need of blustering about it. Still less should it be used as a pretext for our own um, aggrandizement at the expense of any other American state. But most empathetically, we must make it evident that we intend on this point ever to maintain the old American position." End quote. And so there he's mentioning the Monroe Doctrine, and that's an idea in which America is to defend its sphere of influence, which extends basically across the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, the what were once the Spanish islands, which included Cuba, and then down all the way into South America. It was a doctrine intended to keep Europe and other, like such as France and other colonial powers, from overextending their influence into what we saw as now ours, a land that we were to defend and, if not defend, use for our own interest in espousing liberalism, and as well as, the economic benefits that the region could have. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Right. The Monroe, yeah, I do. And the Monroe Doctrine passed in 1825, I believe, maybe 1828, somewhere in the 1820s, under of course the President Monroe. Um, it was a it was a means of again attacking, or warding off European powers as kind of a warning, back up, back out of our space, because it was recognized by the American government only 30, 40, maybe 50 total years of complete existence since the Declaration of Independence, existing that we saw the entire like two continents as being our own sphere of influence because throughout that short time of American independence, um, like because there were still significant parts of those two continents that were governed by European powers in a colonial fashion and colonial style of government. Um, there there were ships, from different European flags, just like flying like all the way through like what were American waters, in the War of 1812, between Britain and America. At the same time, Britain was fighting Napoleon. They went to war because partially because American Navy ships and sailors would be press charged into British service, and a big disrespect to America's sovereignty. So the the European colonial position in the two continents, even by 1825, was a condition. It was a status quo that the Americans wanted to break off. And by 1901, it was something that they had the power to break off. It wasn't just talk anymore. So, um, and also when Teddy says here that this should not be used as a pretext for our own aggrandizement at the expense of any other American state, he's saying that like sure, because according to the Monroe Doctrine, many nations like bordering or nearby America are part of its sphere of influence. Essentially, that's the way that the Monroe Doctrine can be interpreted. It should not be interpreted, as Roosevelt is saying, is that we control these places. That's not the way he says that this should be interpreted. Like just because Mexico, their territory is very close to the American border by 1901, that does not mean that we have the ability to take it over and control it. That's kind of what I mean, what I meant last episode when I said that um, that America doesn't need to take over and annex new territory. At least on the American continent, that has not happened since 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and maybe like the Gadsden Purchase or something. But there has been no territorial annexation since then. And even by 1901, that was over half a century ago. And so our territory has stayed relatively intact, and we haven't felt the need to go invade Canada or invade Mexico and annex territory. So that's what he means when he says, don't be worried about us like using this as an excuse to go take over some American state, like Mexico or whatever, because we don't want to do that. We just want to spread our ideas of freedom, which we believe are so universal to humanity.
Exactly. As we get through this speech and we get towards, the very iconic part, there was another part that when we were reading it kind of piqued our interest, and that was his opposition to barbarism. And so I'd like to read off some of the quotes and we'll do them in order. Quote, barbarism has and can have no place in a civilized world. It is our duty toward the people living in barbarism to see that they are freed from their chains, and we can only free them by destroying barbarism itself. End quote. And then another quote following that I feel is important to follow with that. Quote, the missionary, the merchant, and the soldier may each have to play a part in this destruction, and the consequent uplifting of the people, exactly as it is the duty of a civilized power scrupulously to respect the rights of all weaker civilized powers, and gladly to help those who are struggling towards civilization, so it is the duty to put down savagery and barbarism. End quote. It was one that I found interesting because it's essentially a very colonial idea, and which was one that was still very prevalent of the times, the early 1900s. Civilized nations needing to help out the less civilized to help uplift them, and help them towards civilization. Yeah, that's one that's certainly interesting, especially in our time as we've moved on from this idea of colonial powers of invading these lesser civilized nations. Um, but as you can see, it was definitely a sign of the times as he made that speech, as that was still a pretty common idea, um, as colonies were still all over the place. 1901, Africa was still divided. Latin America, we just had the war with Spain and Cuba. This was still the common idea, and you could still see it being espoused by our soon to be American president.
Right, because in his description of the missionary, particularly, but then also the merchant and the soldier, you can see that what he means by civilization is he means religion. So it wasn't necessarily technically along like ethnic or racial lines because we kind of debunked the idea of race back in the ethno-nationalism series. But yeah, basically he's talking about religion and he's talking about like the abolition of native religion or
Native culture
or
altogether.
yeah,
Because
or
he's
native
talking
culture
about
exactly.
lesser civilized peoples, people who are
Yeah.
living in savagery and barbarism, that they need to be helped by the greater powers to reach that.
Yeah, and when you look at any one of the other American nations, in North America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and South America, by even 1825, when the Monroe Doctrine was passed, um, many nations were independent. I believe Mexico was actually independent by this point. Most of South America, if not all of South America, was independent with the help of Simon Bolivar. And Haiti had just defended itself from Napoleonic invasion. So there were like large sections of North and South America that were independent by that point. And the point I want to make is that once they did become independent, they kept the religion that their colonial masters, previous masters, imposed upon them, which was Christianity. And so maybe you could even get more specific about his idea of civilized. Is that he's not just talking about monotheistic religion or calling against native culture and native religion. He's talking about civilized world as meaning Christian.
Right. It's definitely a good distinction to make. Um, but yeah, as we said, it was definitely a sign of the times that an American president would be espousing this. But not too uncommon, as we said. To go on to the last quote that we have for the speech, and obviously the most iconic as it gives the name of the speech itself. I'll read it off. Quote, "A good many of you are probably acquainted with the old proverb, 'Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far.' If a man continuously blusters, if he lacks civility, a big stick will not save him from trouble, and it neither will speaking softly avail, if the back of the softness there does not lie strength, power." End quote. Once again, this is what gives the speech its name. It's this idea of speak softly and carry a big stick. One way you could see it is the idea of you can espouse the ideas of peace and freedom and the things of liberalism, civilization, as we've kind of described, but that does not mean you only just have to say these things. It has to be backed up and backed up through power. It has to be backed up through strength, military strength, economic strength, alliance strength. But if you do not have any backing to your words, any backing to your policies, your philosophies, it's simply that. It's just words. If you just speak softly and you do not have any power behind you, there's no point. And at the same time, on the contrary, if all you have is power and no values, no no way to really have a trustful negotiation because all you do is bully other countries around, you're not going to get very far. You'll simply just fall. So what you need is a balance between those, a balance between your philosophy and the ideas you espouse and the strength that you project and the strength that you have both internally, which can be seen as order and stability internally, and then the freedom and the democracy that you would espouse outward. You need a balance between those two.
Right. Essentially, the strength and the power that he refers to is the peace that we've been talking about so much, and the civility that he's talking about, which in a hypothetical scenario, a dominant, maybe colonial power that does not value freedom. they are described as in this quote as being the one that lacks civility. A big stick will not save them from trouble. You know, so the civility that he's referring to in this quote is very reminiscent of freedom, and so it can really be looked at even from this quote. The legitimacy of the idea that Chad and I thought of about peace and freedom. And I've been thinking for a while. I had a note about it, and I may just have to kind of give up on it. But I just really, I was going to explain why we chose to call this series Peace v. Freedom over Order v. Chaos. There's a reason for that. I just need to have some time to explain it to you, and that might have to wait. But anyway, um, we're gonna move on to the same president, Theodore Roosevelt, once he actually became president. In the 1904 corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, in where um, it's 3 years after his big stick speech, and he is again talking about America's place in the world, centering largely around the events that led to the initial establishment, the beginning of construction for the American attempt at making a Panama Canal. Started with the French attempt back in the 1860s, 70s, 80s that failed, and now with Theodore Roosevelt and some clever politicking on um, from other international aides that wanted to cut travel time for trade routes. Um, um, the process of developing this canal in full seriousness was undertaken by the U.S. government, um, and this is largely what the speech centers around in context.
Yeah. And so to start it off, once again, excerpts of it. And I'll start off with our first one. Quote, tyrants and oppressors have many times made a wilderness and have called it peace. Many times people who are slothful or timid or short-sighted, who have been enervated by ease or by luxury or misled by false teachings, have shrunk in unmanly fashion from doing duty that was stern and needed self-sacrifice, and have sought to hide from their own minds and their shortcomings, their in their ignoble motives, by calling them love and peace. The peace of a tyrannous terror, the peace of craven weakness, the peace of injustice, all of these should be shunned as we shun unrighteous war. The goal to set before us as a nation, the goal which we should set before all mankind, is the attainment of a peace of justice, of the peace which comes when each nation is not merely safeguarded in its own rights, but scrupulously recognizes and performs its duty towards others. This is from the corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, of course. End quote. And so what you have here is discussing the ideas, one of it's that we discussed earlier, of peace through the non-acknowledgement of a country's problems. We discussed this at the end, kind of towards our discussion about peace and freedom, in saying how in authoritarian societies, they neglect their real issues, they hide them, they act as if they are perfect when really they are shying away from the real issues that need to be addressed. He calls the Roosevelt calls these as weak, as timid, as unmanly, things that should not be present in society as if it was to work for its real greatness. So that was one. I say that's one of the interpretations you could get from this. Is there any you have, Will?
Well, for me, it's interesting because there are a lot of echoes to today. I could look at a million other different historical examples, but today with Putin, you could say, you could say that by ignoring Putin, we have brought peace, or by ignoring Iran from making a nuke, that we call it peace, or North Korea from making a nuke that we're calling it peace. We could ignore like all the crazy tyrants and oppressors around the world that not only oppress its own people, but also oppress other people, like what China hopes to do to Taiwan, or what Russia is doing in Ukraine. You know, if we let loose, you know, um, liberal democracies choke hold over these criminal states and these tyrants leading over these countries, whether it be Russia or China, then we could technically say that by living in some sort of pacifist mindset, that we will have prevented America from going to war. But um, we have a lot more examples, later on. But even just in this quote, we can see that it's often an illusion, the idea that by not stopping those that want war, we will have peace. It really makes no sense when you think about it.
Yeah. And with that, we'll continue with another excerpt that we have from this quote. From this speech. Quote, ordinarily, it is very much wiser and more useful for us to concern ourselves with striving for our own moral and material betterment here at home than to concern ourselves with trying to better the condition of things in other nations. We have plenty of sins of our own to war against, and under ordinary circumstances, we can do more for the general uplifting of humanity by striving with heart and soul to put a stop to civic corruption, to brutal lawlessness and violent race prejudices here at home, than by passing resolutions and wrongdoing elsewhere. Nevertheless, there are occasional crimes committed on such a vast scale and of such peculiar horror as to make us doubt whether it is not our manifest duty to endeavor at least to show our disapproval of the deed and our sympathy with those who have suffered by it. The cases must be extreme in which such a course is justifiable. There must be no effort made to remove the mote from our brother's eye if we refuse to remove the beam from our own. End quote. So that with this one, we have him discussing the what seems as a contradiction of being involved outside of our nation when our country has many problems of its own to face. This is something that I would see as an isolationist would bring up, in which we should not be involved with other countries because we have the problems of our own. But however, what you could have here is through Roosevelt's end of the speech, he says that sometimes there are crimes so horrific, of such a peculiar horror, as to make us, in the quote, as to make us doubt whether it is not our own manifest duty at least to show our disapproval at the deed and our sympathy with those who are suffered by it. End quote. He's saying that sometimes there are things that go on outside of our country, outside of our sphere of influence, that are so terrible that we, as a liberal society, as a society that hopes to uphold these values across the world, that sometimes things are so bad that we need to speak out about it, that we need to get involved, that we have to put a stop to it, because it is simply our right as a liberal democracy to ensure that these values are upheld across the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Roosevelt's claim in this quote that we also have many sins of our own to war against, it's very it's reassuring. It's assuring that our leaders, even back then, even a white guy back near the year 1900, that was raised into upper class society, would be able to admit even then, um, um, that there are a lot of problems with America internally, whether they be race crimes or civic corruption, lawlessness, that that he recognizes. And of course, as president, he would know about this, but it's just really interesting that he was able to publicly admit that America does have its own problems on its own, and just like kind of rebutting that argument, just addressing the argument made by a pacifist, that they might have made back in 1914 or 1939 when world wars were starting in Europe. That you know, that sure, we have problems of our own and we have to fix them. That's why Roosevelt was so eager to bring Booker T. Washington into to meet with him in the White House at the beginning of his presidency. He was eager to do it. But it was only until you know he was under threat of Southern Republicans from withdrawing votes away from his party and away from him himself in any future elections, or just like sliding of support, or um, further warnings of further attacks against racial minorities in the future, that he went back on further action. But that is a bit of a side quest, but it's interesting that he admits that. He admits that America has its own problems, but there are times when crimes that are going on outside of our country that normally would not be our problem, that are just so big, and so horrible that we just can't ignore it. Like it's almost as if Roosevelt is saying here, what kind of a country would we be if we let that happen?
Exactly. We can't say that we are a liberal democracy, one that values freedom, rights of people in our own country, if we just believe that to be only people in our own country. If we believe that liberalism is the system for the world, is the system for Europe, and therefore should be the system all across the globe, we can't just act like it should be only for us. If there's something that violates these principles so dearly that it takes the notice of the entire world, it's a disservice for us to just sit back on the sidelines and act as if it's not our problem. If we have these values, we have to back them up. In his speech, the big stick speech, to go back to that, he referenced in that there must be no deed that is not backed up by action. If we are to really value these values, we must follow through. If we're going to talk the talk, we must walk the walk. And that can't be just be within our country. It has to be around the world too. And it was interesting in the last point that he acknowledges that this is kind of a balance between them. There's no quote, there must be no effort made to remove the mote from our brother's eye if we refuse to remove the beam from our own. We have to do both. That's kind of what he says. But that international part is still important.
Hey Chad, I'm thinking of screen sharing the source that we have, because I just found a quote that um I noticed that we didn't have plan on speaking, that actually fits really well with the point we're making about international law.
Yeah, have at it.
All right, good. So this is archives.gov, and this is the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah, and they conflict over what time it was that we had, but whatever. This is the part I wanted to really hit at, and this is going to lean a little bit over to our future series of Modern Empire, but it's relevant to what Roosevelt's saying in the corollary. I know we have limited time, but just to read this off, if you guys can already see it, you guys can probably pause and read, but I'm going to read it off anyway. It is our duty to remember that a nation has no more right to do injustice to another nation, strong or weak, than an individual has to do injustice to another individual. That the same moral law applies in one case as in the other. But we must also remember that it is as much the duty of the nation to guard its own rights and its own interests as it is the duty of the individual to do so. Within the nation, the individual has now delegated this right to the state, that is, to the representatives of all the individuals, and it is a maxim of the law that for every wrongdoing, there is a remedy. But in international law, we have not advanced by any means as far as we have advanced in municipal law. There is as yet no judicial way of enforcing a right in international law. When one nation wrongs another or wrongs many others, there is no tribunal before which the wrongdoer can be brought. End quote. So you guys can see it, of course, but I just chose to read it because I wanted to hear that for myself. I wanted to hear it more than read it because this is a major problem that American statesmen have had for a while. International law is not strong enough to stop bad things from happening. So, American leaders, American governments have kind of been wrestling with the question of um, what do you
What do you do if if the governing bodies across the world can't solve their own problems? When
right.
something has to be solved, someone has to step in.
Exactly. And by asking the question of what sort of a nation would we be if we let these terrible things happen, like what's going on in Ukraine right now, or if
Yeah,
China were to invade Taiwan, or the human rights atrocities that were being conducted by the Butcher, as he was known, a Spanish military commandant that was sent to Cuba in the 1890s. What sort of a nation would we be as Americans to let that happen? We made that choice in 1917 when we joined World War One. We made that choice in 1941 when we were bombed by Japan, at Pearl Harbor.
yeah.
So, what sort of a nation would we be if we let these things happen? International law is not strong enough to stop them from happening. So, America, with all its might, they asked the question, should we stop it? So anyway, we got to leave with that. We are the marshals of truth. Just like settle with that question. We'll be back next time. All right, bye guys.